So as more cases of coronavirus surface, it raises worries of the virus's economic impact. So for more on what this could mean for Canada, I'm joined now by Brian Kingston, Vice President of International and Fiscal Issues with the Business Council of Canada, and he's in our Ottawa studio. Thank you so much for joining us, Brian.
Thanks for having me on.
So first, we have the question about the concerns regarding the impact of coronavirus on Canada's economy. And specifically, we know that China is a manufacturing hub. So what sort of impact and what sort of industries are we going to start seeing if we haven't seen it already?
Yeah, well, the immediate impact that we're seeing right now is, of course, on the travel, tourism, and hospitality industries. Air Canada has canceled all flights to China through April, and we know that air travel globally is looking like it's on track to have its worst year since the financial crisis. So they'll take the immediate impact. What we're watching, though, is what will this mean for supply chains that rely on inputs from China? Currently, about 10% of our intermediate inputs into Canadian supply chains come from China. So as this carries on and Chinese factories remain closed, you're going to see sectors, for example, in auto parts and manufacturing, as well as in the high-tech sector, where we really rely on Chinese inputs. They will end up having to slow operations as they wait for more imports from China.
So far, are there any particular industries that we've already seen that impact?
Yeah, there have been three that have recently said that they've actually had to halt production lines. So the first, Fiat Chrysler has done that at a factory in Europe. Hyundai has recently closed down temporarily a line, and then Apple has indicated that its financial guidance is no longer relevant for this quarter because iPhone production has been slowed. So it's happening all around the world. We haven't heard any Canadian companies making that announcement yet, but the important thing to note here is that most Chinese factories close just before the Chinese New Year at the end of January. Typically, a ship takes about 30 days to get to North America, and companies have about 10 to 15 days of inventory on hand. So the impact is going to be really felt throughout the month of March.
And we've also seen that those flights, as you were mentioning, air travel and tourism, at least with Air Canada, it's until April 1st, I believe, was the last piece of information we got from the airline. So given that the tourism industry in that regard will be impacted, also wondering, not in regards to China, but in regards to Canada itself, with all of the other travel destinations, people now sort of thinking twice about traveling, period. What impact will that have on Canadian Airlines? Do you think we might see, sort of the shrinking of the volume of other routes?
I think that's possible, and that's what's really difficult to predict with something like this. If it does reach the point where it becomes a pandemic and you see more countries putting in place stricter border controls and very strict travel advisories, then that will have an impact on consumer confidence and consumer choices. So, Canadians willing to travel abroad, you probably won't see that as much. It's hard to predict how significant that could be, but the fear factor associated with something like this could be quite substantial.
And I'm sure you've also been keeping an eye on the market. So in terms of what we're seeing on the TSX, et cetera, what sort of impact are Canadians feeling on that front? And that, for a great deal, is due to the uncertainty regarding coronavirus.
That's right. I mean, the markets took a massive hit this past week. And, we're starting now to see the actual impact on the Canadian economy as well, which will hurt Canadians. So most economists are expecting that the first quarter will grow by about 0.3% less. It doesn't sound like much, but that could grow if this becomes a bigger problem. And just to give you some context, I mean, most economists are using the SARS pandemic as an example, or an example of how to predict what this will mean for the Canadian economy. But in 2003, China was responsible for about 4% of global GDP. They're now responsible for almost 20%, and they're our second largest export partner. So the impact of this, with 80,000 cases confirmed, could be far more significant than SARS, and that's why it's concerning for the Canadian economy.
And in several different ways for the Canadian economy, too. So why don't we quickly touch on housing and whether or not it will have an impact on housing and real estate within Canada?
There's absolute potential for that. I mean, Chinese nationals do purchase a lot of Canadian housing, of course, and that's been a reason why we've seen such hot markets in places like Vancouver and Toronto. But with potential for out-and-out travel bans, you could see a temporary depression of housing prices as people are unable to actually visit the country and make those purchases. However, I think that if that were to occur, it's probably likely to be more of a short-term depression because once this is past us, you'll see that demand return and prices return to normal levels.
And just finally, for our viewers, wondering on a day-to-day basis how they may feel the impact of the manufacturing, of the travel tourism, all of this impact every day when they're going to pick up things from the store or when they're going about their daily business.
Yeah, day to day, what you might start to see with these supply chain impacts is that products simply won't be available. Things that come from China that are no longer being produced and that inventories have run out of may simply not be available on store shelves. So I think that's the most immediate impact. If this carries on, particularly as we enter into the peak tourism season here in Canada, Chinese tourists spend on average about $2,800 per trip, and they come to Canada for about 30 days. That is the longest and biggest spend of any tourist to Canada. So we could see a scenario where we just won't see the tourism volumes, and as a Canadian day to day, you'll actually notice that there are less tourists here.
All right, well, we appreciate all of your insights today. Thank you so much for your time, Brian.
Thank you.
Brian Kingston is with the Business Council of Canada, and he joined us today from Ottawa.